This is Kenya's the number one opera in the world, according to Thorin. You're watching Thorin channel, that are also known as the number one existence fan in the world.
The wait is over. It's been announced that at ECS this weekend, the new G2 lineup will make its debut. So we saw previously that there was rumours of this particular lineup. We didn't know whether it would play under the G2 organisation, but they have officially moved NBK and Apex to the bench. They're no longer active players. They've brought in existence former G2 player, most recently in LDLC. He's come in as the in-game leader. They've brought SmithZz, former coach, former player, back from inactivity. He'd been removed as the coach. And shox comes back from being benched, but largely just so he could have surgery on his wrist, where he was having some kind of wrist injury, RSI issues. And kennyS and Body, who've been in the most recent active G2 lineup, been in the team for well over a year, they're coming in as part of the new lineup. So I have to say, this is not really a shuffle so far in the traditional sense of the French shuffles. I have to say also, quite frankly, it's been way too long since the true sense of the shuffle. I know shuffle on the surface just means you move a bunch of names around. But the reason why the old French shuffles, the first two, were interesting is you had some level of equivalence. You know, you made good teams out of them, or there was the potential for good teams, or at least someone quality went back and forth. So even in the second French shuffle, where yes, clearly Envious won it, it wasn't entirely clear cut. I mean, you did still have a fabulous player in shox, one of the best in the world at the time, going the other way to what at the time was Titan and later became G2. If you think of the last French shuffle, the one where they made this French super team lineup, the really envy team was the leftovers. The fact that Existence didn't actually go and join that team, and they didn't really make all the best French talent. Obviously, Kiyoshima was off over playing in FaZe at the time. I think it was at that point in time. Meant that there wasn't really an option to make a second best French team that was going to be legit. And obviously the lineup under HawpT was pretty poor. So when you also consider that with this move happening, it's already been pointed out that NBK is apparently going to go to Cloud9. There's a possibility Apex also might join him. No one really knows yet. NBK and Apex, both players who can talk English, both players who have pretty decent relationships with players outside of the French scene. They could absolutely, and it seems fairly likely, not remain within the French scene. And so you end up with also not as much talent in the French scene. So again, it doesn't feel like a true shuffle. Then you look at the Envious lineup. That lineup is absolutely in disarray right now. They're falling apart anyway. We've gotten news that HawpT and RPK are not going to go to the Asian CSGO Championship with the team. They can use different players. So no one knows what's going on in the French scene except this new G2 lineup. So obviously this is a move we knew about before. We knew in the past when shox announced that he was having to go inactive and that he was going to have the wrist surgery and that he wanted to make a new team. It came out, he did an interview with Ocelot, that he wanted to make this lineup that would be bringing in Existence as the in-game leader and bringing back SmithZz from inactivity. So because there was a battle within G2 politically, people like MBK didn't want to do this move, it ended up being the case that we heard, okay, either the new G2 lineup, which was going to be NBK as in-game leader and bring in Mixwell, either that lineup succeeds and that just becomes G2 from then on, and this Existence shox SmithZz lineup goes elsewhere, plays for another organization, or the G2 lineup with NBK and Mixwell doesn't end up succeeding, at least according to the organization, and they decide to remove that lineup, and they give the Existence shox SmithZz stack a chance under G2, which is essentially what has happened. Now, in the scenario in which they get to stay in G2, we already knew that they didn't want NBK, they didn't want Apex. Like, Existence wants MBK, but shox didn't want MBK because he had his own qualms about whether he had the right personality and whether or not he fit with the team, and also it was just clear that MBK didn't want to play with them, quite frankly. So that MBK and shox seem to have been the primary dispute within the G2 lineup. Funnily enough, they also had their own issues when they were at the end of their time in Envious, when the second French shuffle happened and shox was kicked out of the team, and after that failed coup d'etat over HawpT. So the players they wanted to make up the fourth and fifth spots on this Existence shox SmithZz lineup were going to be Body and kennyS, the players that indeed are this particular lineup. Now, G2 gave MBK his chance with a different lineup. They gave him a chance to be the in-game leader. It didn't really work out, quite frankly. They never really had any big placings. They didn't really get any big scalps in terms of wins. They had a few games that looked all right, but that was about it. And then they had some games that were unconvincing against lesser squads. And all in all, T-sides weren't that great. It was hard to look at the squad and see that many of the players were playing to a high level. There weren't really any factors to suggest that if you gave them more opportunity that it was going to improve much. MBK did get a chance to implement his system and his style of in-game leadership. Couldn't really make Mixwell work in the lineup. Body was playing fairly poorly. Kenny S wasn't in peak form, didn't seem motivated. MBK himself was limited due to being an in-game leader. There wasn't really any reason to keep it going. Like, they gave him a fair crack at the whip. He didn't manage to get much done. Now, I had a past video in which I explained what I saw as some of the logic. I speculated a little bit, knowing the history of the players, some of the political factions within the different French teams, of why I thought this move was being put together, why they did and didn't choose certain players. But the moves come together now. So let's use the classic formula I always use with roster moves. And let's ask, first of all, whether G2 removing NBK and Apex from the active lineup is a good move. Now, on the basis just of who they are as players and the roles that not only have they embraced, but have been at their best at over the last few years, it's very hard to make a real case that you should replace them as players. I would actually go ahead and say that as a supportive type player or second entry, and as an entry, pure entry, Apex and NBK are probably the best players you've got in the scene at the moment right now. There's players who could maybe contend with them, but they have the best history, the best legacy. They've got prestige, they've accomplishments. They've even more recently been pretty good or decent at those roles, depending on whether we're talking about Apex or NBK, respectively. So on those grounds, no, I don't really think I would agree with or say it was reasonable to remove them. But when you know that the French scene, this is something I always stress in these roster moves, is largely dictated by politics and by morale in the team and the sentiment of which players want to work together and whether they believe in each other's concepts and buy in, then you will understand why these players aren't in the team. So in terms of NBK, he not only has a storied and acrimonious history, recent and historical, with shox, who has wanted to be the star player and who's at times wanted to take over the team when he didn't agree with the direction of the squad, whereas MBK has in multiple times with shox squads tried to be the in-game leader. So at the beginning of the LDLC team, after they made the first French shuffle, then obviously you had more recently when you had this G2 lineup where shox came out of the lineup, MBK became the in-game leader, shox didn't want to play under MBK as an in-game leader. So MBK has his own issues with shox, and then as I alluded to as well, what led to the second French shuffle where MBK was very much aligned with HawpT and against shox and thought that shox shouldn't necessarily be the star player and the in-game leader, and he didn't want to go that direction. Then you have MBK's issue with Existence, who he was at one point in time one of Existence's right-hand men. He came up with Existence at the end of Source in early CSGO, had success, stuck with Existence after shox left the first time around, after they'd kicked Kenny S, came with him all through to 2014. Then the first French shuffle happened, and a key point of the French shuffle is that Existence thought he was getting MBK into his side of the shuffle. So he was going to have players like Kenny S, Apex, MBK, and he thought he was going to have the better squad. In fact, the key piece ended up being MBK, who then really embraced his role as the kingmaker as opposed to it being Existence before. He went over to LDLC and he made LDLC the better team. He became one of the best support players in the world. They ended up winning with different lineups, LDLC and then Envious, 2 different majors, and MBK was a part of that, and those are the only majors the French scene has ever won. So MBK has his own issues with Existence. He has just disagreed, as you'll see in my reflections with him, with his style of play. He thinks he's outdated. He didn't want to play under him anymore. Thinks he's perhaps too strict, and generally favoured the HawpT, free-form, let your star players play off each other style that has very much been embraced by many of the top players and many of the most successful teams in CSGO history. So logical as to why NBK wouldn't fit or wouldn't want to be, and why some of those players wouldn't necessarily want him around either in this lineup. So you can see why he's not there. In terms of Apex, it's a little bit more strange. First of all, I get the sense that the fact that Apex was against this project and against shox's move is definitely a factor. That means that someone like shox doesn't want to play with him. Then it seems like shox didn't feel like he was the right personality to go along with it, and that he wasn't the sort of person who was going to maybe actively give feedback and be willing to give his opinion and be part of this process of where shox feels like they need a new in-game leader and they have to rebuild their whole game. So maybe Apex isn't someone who's in line with that. I mean, I think certainly he's a very good role player in terms of what he does, but okay, fair enough. Then you got to look at the fact that one thing that's almost inarguable is G2 and the French scene in general definitely did need an in-game leader, and certainly someone who's got history of doing it's not going to give up after a few months, and who's been through the hard times. So they also definitely needed shox. I mean, right now, it's hard to look at any French team and say they don't need Kenny S and shox. I mean, you almost certainly do. So if it's about getting an in-game leader, there's not many options. And if it's about, and you certainly have to remove the ones you've got, shox and MBK, and if it's about getting shox back, I'm sorry, you've got to do whatever it is that you need to do to get shox back, unless you're going to make some fabulous lineup with basically everyone except shox. So in terms of who they've added, okay, they added Existence as an in-game leader. Now, people will know I'm a long-time admirer of Existence's style, his strengths as an in-game leader. I think as a pure captain, he's fabulous. He has, at times earlier in his career in CSGO, perhaps been a bit too strict, but at the same time, you look at the other captains in the French scene, their entire problem has been an inability to be strict and an inability to get people to do what they want to do beyond being fabulous in-game leader, player rather, like happy, and therefore things just working. Also giving a lot of freedom to players. That's not the same as telling a player what to do. You're actually telling him you do what you want to a degree within the broader spectrum of what I want to happen overall in the squad, but we're going to allow a lot of individual play. You'll choose when timings happen, when a duel takes place, whether you fight in a force buy scenario. Very much a player's in-game leader at one point in time was happy. Existence is the only true in-game leader the French scene currently has. You might say Major over in the Space Soldiers team. That's a tough one because he seems like he's pretty loose in how he uses that team. He hasn't really proven himself on a top level in CSGO, so I don't really know that he's gotten the position. It'd be a big gamble to give him a chance. So you look at Existence, I can see why they bring him as in-game leader. I've always thought people massively overplayed him being a bad individual player. He was much improved at the end of G2 when he wasn't much of an in-game leader. And in LDLC, he absolutely improved that up much more. He certainly wasn't a bot. Then you've got to factor in you need a real in-game leader. He's the obvious person left to try. There's no one else left to try. Everyone else has run their course. So it's time to give this guy his big chance again. Then you look at shox, right? You've got to get shox back in the team if you can. He is the best French player in the history of Counter-Strike, all versions of Counter-Strike combined. In CSGO, every 1 to 2 years, he manages to get back to being an elite level player, one of the best players in the world, with the best star player, hard carries in the world, always fantastic at what he does. His longevity is unbelievable in CSGO terms. You look at the people who he was competing with back in 2013, where are those guys now? Pretty much none of them are at an elite level, except Kenny S, funnily enough, or at different points in time. Then you look at SmithZz, right? The primary factor to think about when you think about SmithZz here is not SmithZz as an individual player, it's the role he will play in terms of the team dynamic. So first and foremost, let's be real. He is there because shox wants him there. So he is essentially there to keep shox happy. Now that is no small feat. Shox is a player who one of the reasons why he has a couple of years between his peaks is he loses motivation or he loses morale within, or rather he starts to affect the morale of a team and he no longer buys into what an in-game leader is doing and he wants to have a different person in the team or a different style of how the team's going to run, or he wants to change his own role in the team. And as a result, you keep SmithZz with him. You've got a teammate there he trusts, who's going to do what he wants, who's going to help facilitate shox having a good mentality, feeling like he's got someone he can have time off with, so he's not going to get as burned out, hopefully. Shox has had SmithZz there during every year of his peak in CSGO. That is an absolute fact. 2013, fabulous. You go to 2015 when he became fabulous again in Envious just before he got kicked. SmithZz was right there with him. Then you go to 2016 when he was amazing in G2. SmithZz was there again. All of them have coincided with SmithZz. So you know what? I don't necessarily buy into the logic that you have to have some talismanic teammate who helps you or you have to have friends to get let off steam. But I do know different players are different in their mentalities and their temperament. And shox is such a fabulous player who transcends the game and even what most other stars are like in terms of form, in terms of ability to get back to the top, that you know what? If this works for him and he says this has to work, we can give it a go. I don't think that's unreasonable. He might know better than us in this particular scenario what he needs as a particular person. Same as there are players who I won't name in the scene that actually, from getting to know some of them, do need to have wild nights and need to be allowed sometimes halfway through to go out and to just party and do all sorts of crazy shit, because getting to know them as people, they are such fabulous players, and when they do play the game, they're so dedicated, they need, to some degree, to take their mind off things, to be able to obliterate themselves for a night, as it were, to erase all the second guessing and the questions. It's just one of those weird things where, yes, it wouldn't work for most people. It would be a terrible idea for most people. But what poisons one person can be the cure for another. Buying into a little bit my old Paracelsus there. So you've also got to add in that SmithZz has a joint history, not just with shox, but with Existence. So he was a part of the best of the Envious lineups, which in my opinion was the first Envious lineup, the one that was top 4 at pretty much every tournament, won a major, was a fabulous team. Yes, the only team they couldn't beat was Fnatic, but you know what? They were amazing against everyone else, and they really had a shot at making that their era at one point in time. Then you had the Very Games lineup. The best Very Games lineup was the one in the latter half of 2013, where they won more tournaments than NiP. They were the number 1 team in the world. They beat NiP many, many times. Yes, they didn't win that major, so it really spoils. It didn't cap like a true era, but they were a fabulous team, and in many ways, they were a contender for the best French team we've ever had, except in terms of raw accomplishments, because they didn't win a major, whereas some of the other lineups did, obviously. I will also say, he's someone, and so as a result, he's also been there when Existence has been at his best, and when the French scene generally has been at its best. And he's someone who always aligns himself to the team concept and what his in-game leader wants. So he's got shared history with Existence going back in the source. Then you've got to add in, he's someone who prides himself on being a supportive element. And I've said it derisively that he has told me, I'm the best flashbang player in the world. If you look at the demo, they're always blind when I'm killing them. Like, that might be a ridiculous premise, but there is something to it. SmithZz is someone who has that mentality. He's going to work with the team concept. He absolutely doesn't think he should need to be the star player. I think that G2 lineup where they were all playing free form and he was trying to AWP all the time, some of that was just trying to be someone he wasn't. Like, if you look at the rest of his career, it makes sense that he would be a supportive element. He has been good at that at times. Certainly not the best, but he's been good at it. Now let's look at the team overall. And there's a logic to this team, because first of all, if you bring Existence back, you are bringing him back explicitly to bring a tactical style. shox has basically admitted there needs to be a real captain, someone who can keep people accountable, who can call him out on his bullshit and have battles with him and not just say, well, you're the best player, I've got to have you in the team, so I guess I'll just let you do what you want. That's what they want. They want a true captain, a general, as it were. Go and watch that classic speech from Existence before that semi-final at DreamHack. Yes, they didn't win, but it's a fantastic speech. It's the sort of mentality you want from an in-game leader. But if they're going to run this tactical style, one thing you do have to be prepared for is that it's going to take longer to implement than someone like a Karrigan coming into a team and saying, right, we're going to run a very simple, this couple of maps first, and we're going to do some freeform stuff, and we're going to give the star a lot of power, and we're going to try and get something going from the very day one that we play in competition, and then over time we'll tweak the style and we'll add elements. This is going to be a full overhaul. So I'm going to go ahead and say, within my principle that within 3 or 4 lands, you tend to know who a team is, they're going to take the full 3 to 4 to really hit top gear. They're going to have to build up their map pool. Now, admittedly, Existence has a history of being able to master all the maps, even maps that actually traditionally they weren't that good at. So when Train got brought back, that initially cost Titan. They didn't get to the playoffs at DreamHack Tours in 2015. By the time he got to the next year, that was one of their best maps. Then you had Overpass, a map again they avoided as much as they could generally during the time they were in the Titan with Kenny S. And then when you were going to the G2 squad with shox just before Existence got kicked. But what happened just before Existence got kicked? In the first part of 2016, that became one of their best maps. They were getting wins over better teams, top 10 teams on that map, because again, Existence had put his mind to it, they'd mastered that map. So throughout history, he has been able to show that he can adapt to pretty much every map in the pool and make it viable and build his system on it. Now, his history has been marred by one key problem, which players like some of the ones that we're talking about talked to me about when they said they didn't want to play Existence, which I totally understand, which is that one of the issues is Existence went too heavy on trying to put in a massive playbook of executes and reads and anti-strats and a flowchart of every single moment of a map on T sides of some of these maps. So as a result, he would tunnel too much on not just getting a map to a very good level, but going into every level of detail on that map. And as a result, too much of the time, they'd have 3 to 4 really good maps, then they'd have 1 or 2 they might be able to play, and then the drop-off was too huge. And as a result, if they got a bad veto, if there was a randomizer like there was in the past, that is something they felt cost them. So if he has learned from that lesson, and then combines it with this ability to have a deep map pool, then yes, in 3 or 4 lands, they could be a very good team. Then you look at the fact that, yes, they're going to have this tactical basis and the personnel is there to have a tactical basis. But I would go ahead and guess, and from some of the things I've heard talking to some of the individuals in question, that actually Existence understands this isn't going to be like rewinding the clock back to 2013, 2014, 2015. He has to blend some of his tactical basis with some of the modern day, let's call it the French style of mid-round calling and free-form play and giving the star players some autonomy. Now, the fact that he's pairing up with shox again suggests he understands that, because every time in history he's had to pair with shox, like 2013, part of that has been relinquishing some control to shox in terms of shox's individual autonomy, because he's such a fabulous star player at intuitively reading the game, but also letting shox do a little bit of mid-round calling, some secondary calling, which is probably where shox's strength lies when you think of the 2016 lineup when he was the in-game leader and he had him and Scream banging into sites and then just having to do simple mid-round calls and a stable player in terms of RPK. But then you think of when he was at his best as a player in a team like LDLC, in the old very games, it was as a secondary caller that shox could add more than just a star player element to the team. So I think having Existence come in at shox's behest means that you're going to see some blend of it. Now, it's going to be more towards the tactical side, I'd go ahead and guess. I think it should be with this personnel, but they'll have an element of that because they've got these two massive superstars in shox and kennyS who absolutely can play the game themselves and make reads themselves. And that's why they're players who get back to the top again, no matter what team they're on and against whatever opposition. I also do think that Existence's time being kicked out of G2, being down in the dumps of LDLC and working with lower level players and seeing the French scene for the last few years where they've gone to shit with too much of the individual freeform style has taught him how you can introduce and integrate some of these elements to make them good when you've got these good players, but not go too far and make that your whole style and bank on that entirely. So first of all, the tactical style can be very effective. Any notion that it ever went out of fashion or was outmoded, no. Maybe having a pure tactical style and only running executes might have been. And even then, I would say players like Blade, players like MSL as in-game leaders still got a remarkable amount of success with lesser lineups over the years, using that style as a hard counter to some of the freeform style teams and the generally more mid-round calling based on information and reads style that people like Fallen, Fnatic, these guys pioneered and made very, very effective. Karrigan, obviously another great name you can add there. I mean, you just look at the Glaive lineups of Astralis, they've been tactical teams. They've been teams that had mid-round elements, but also had executes and had tactics and had deep utility understanding and rotations that were based off intricate play calls, but also anti-stratting and reading the opponents. So Astralis right now is the best team in the world by far, and they're showing us the power of tactical play when you then combine it with good players. But it's not like they have all the best players, and some of those players overnight just became way better. No, their style and the team element works so well that having good players as well elevates them to look like very good players. That's the thing about a tactical style properly implemented with the right personnel. It elevates lesser players in the team to look better because the team generally will be more effective, more dynamic, more ruthless, quite frankly, in their ability to get the most out of players. Whereas sometimes the freeform style gets the most out of some players and other players have to just be make weights and do what they can within that system, which I think you see sometimes people like Sticko, for example, suffer from that, but it is a strength for his teammates. The key element of this team, which you can't overstress, is that shox and kennyS can make this team magical if they can both get to a good level. I'm talking about, they don't have to get a peak level. If they can get to 85 to 90% of what we know of as their peak form, even over the last couple of years, 2016 shox, 2017 kennyS, so not unrealistic. We're not talking about they have to be 2013 shox or they have to be 2015 kennyS. No, that would be unrealistic or an unreasonable demand. If they can just get to where historically they're able to consistently get back to, this team can already be fabulous, because those are two star players who are not just two of the best star players we've ever had in terms of raw peak form, skill set and longevity, but they also should, we've never got to really see it because shox is the in-game leader of the last G2 lineup, they should complement each other fantastically. Obviously, the only lineup they've ever played in together was the Nations Cup lineup from 2014 and the G2 lineup where shox was an in-game leader and didn't make himself a star. If you put them together as star players with that mentality in mind, which is what shox says he has, and I know kennyS wants, then you have an AWP player who's a dominant AWPer and a fabulous early pick-off player and great CT player in kennyS who can hold all of his angles a million times over because he's so experienced at it. Then you have this fabulous mid-round rifle player with some secondary calling elements and an amazing understanding and ability to clutch, Put those two in a team, you could already see where, as a two-man game, they could take over the match. And the parts of the game they're going to be having their fingerprints put on are different. And so you could have a massive amount of impact from those two just as stars. You look at the other three, and yes, I do have my qualms. If it was up to me, I would want an MBK or an Apex or an RPK to have a little bit more firepower maybe. But they're going with a more supportive element with the other three for my money. If you look at Body, SmithZz, and Existence, their success should ride on whether they can make the system work, they can implement it fully, they can understand all the tactics, and they can allow autonomy from KennyS and shox, but they will be the connective tissue to the rest of the team and make it a team as opposed to two stars and some pieces trying to do what they can and be more of the freeform style of a mouse sports and these other squads that we see out there. Now, if you look at it, all they really need to do is make the system work and support these two players who could be two of the best in the world. Now, I will say, Body is the question mark because we have seen in the past, admittedly, it was when he was very inexperienced as a top pro. He has been able to contribute more in terms of fragging. I do think if he's given a little bit of room here, because Existence and SmithZz are presumably going to play more of the pure supportive elements, he could have some room to have better roles that he's had and to get a bit of fragging going. He's still a very young player, both in terms of age and experience level. I could also see him being able to contribute more there. Anything you get in that sense as a bonus is gravy. It's not necessary, but it could be what makes this team have the firepower to, beyond the top two players, go head-to-head with the top teams in the world. But for me, it's more for Body about having consistency, about having a good level, and about being able to play within the system and frag, rather than be a star player in any sense or put up raw numbers. Now, in terms of Existence, a lot of this is going to depend on his role and his mentality. I don't think he's going to be like in 2015 Titan, where, because he had KennyS and he had Apex and not a whole lot else, he had to literally throw himself into the worst possible positions. He had to sometimes hard entry. He had to basically play like a bot, throw guns for KennyS anytime he had the opportunity, and so his numbers went to shit. If you look at Existence, when he's been in LDLC or the end of G2, he's gotten his level to a half-decent level. In fact, for an in-game leader, especially a tactical one, he's one of the better ones in terms of fragging and overall skill set. I think people are riding an old narrative thinking that he's a bot overall, so I think he might surprise people in terms of actual in-game ability, especially when they're playing a little bit towards the shox style over the Existence style, a little bit more freeform and letting the stars carry them at times on certain maps. I think you will see some of that. Then you've got to throw in his whole reason for staying in the game was this motivation that he wanted to win a major. He didn't want to retire before he'd won a major. He hasn't done that yet. The best he did was that top 4 with VeXii games at the first major. So he knows that his chance was never really going to come in LDLC. He was hoping he could get some talent there, or that some other player would come along and willingly be shaped by him. Never really fully happened on either respect. Didn't want to go and make a second best team that would just be a top 10 team with HawpT and RPK and Scream. And he wasn't going to get back in a G2 at the time. And seemingly that horse had ridden and bolted and the ship had sailed, and so that seemed to be it. Now that he has his real shot, not just to have the two best players in French history at the same time, which he's never had. He's had lineups with KennyS two times over. He's had lineups with shox 2 or 3 times over. He's never had both of those amazing transcendent talents at the same time. So he's got a chance to do something he's never done in his whole career, and to actually potentially reach heights he's never seen before, which is a big deal when you consider what he did in Source for VeXii games, the best team ever, and in CSGO, one of the best teams ever early on, and then some very good lineups throughout the years with diminishing returns as the star players left him and somewhat put him out into the wilderness and exile for a while. So the motivation for Existence should be higher than ever. I know that he is a guy who has still been putting in the hours, has still put in the work, even when he was in LDLC, as if he was going to have a top team and be able to play as a top pro. He hasn't just gone, oh, I'm in LDLC, I'll just half-ass it. You got to say, SmithZz is the one who has the big black mark against him, because he was in a pretty bad spot when he left. And he's coming back from almost entire inactivity. He says he's been playing CSDM. That's not the same as playing pro level CS. But he has a history of being decent. He has had a decent amount of longevity in his own career. In theory, you don't need as much fragging from him, but if you're going to have him and Existence, you need at least some. So, okay, I'll say there's a big question mark on him. He could mess the lineup up. But then again, let's add this factor in. He could be a stepping stone. Or Body could be a stepping stone. If one of these players doesn't work, maybe you do get MBK in 6 months from now when you've got a pretty good team and you're a top 5 team, but you need to break through. It hasn't worked out for him in Cloud9 or wherever else, or in Mouse Sports. He comes over and now you've got a fabulous team and you've got more firepower, or maybe you get RPK later on. Maybe you bring him back into the fold, make it even more of a VeXii Games 2.0. Maybe later on, you come and you get Scream. Maybe you say, hey, can you fit as a third player? Can you fit as a hybrid star? Can you do a bit of this and a bit of that? And we'll make it a little bit looser. Who knows what direction you go. Once you get this nice team in place and you get pieces that work, then you can figure out where the squeaky wheel is and how much lubrication needs to be put on that motherfucker. So I think, I'm not just saying this based on nostalgia, I think the pieces are here to be one of the best teams in the world, to be a team that actually could win a major, because you've got French power players, the best of all time, finally harnessed by one of the best traditional in-game leaders, which you've never had in CSGO before. So the firepower, admittedly, is very heavily weighted into 2 players, but if you ever wanted 2 players to put that firepower into, you've got 2 players who have hard-carried teams themselves in the past, at times alone, at times with a sidekick, and they're going to play together, and they complement each other. They're not like 2 players who play on the left side of the court in basketball, and they have to take turns and watch the other guy while he goes one-on-one, and they sit on the outside of the elbow or whatever. No, they can both be in position to be a dual threat, and you've got to pick your poison when you play against these guys. Then you've got to add in, they've got a great history of supportive play from the supportive elements. They've got a tactical system they want to implement, but with some of the new school flavor. And finally, if you have watched French CSGO for the last few years, as I have, and you loved it when it was at its peak, even in the happy, like, death ball era, they're finally going to have something approaching modern day proper economical management. So with the talent that they have in this squad and the history that they have in this squad, there are a lot of question marks, but there is a massive amount of potential and a very high ceiling, and you can take that to the bank. This video was made possible by Dean Tanglis, Sanity, G-Man, Andreas, Snazore, Westerlund, Alex Adams, Mikkel Hansen, Jerky's Minion, Anthony, Bash, Daniel Yordanov, Yordan Tsenkov, TTMXMP, VeXii, HawpT, Travis T. Greb. Just like my man, a lot of people think you can't tell me nothing, but I've graduated from that mindset. And now it is possible to have influence over some of the people I have on my shows, some of the topics I cover, to ask me questions directly and get exclusive teasers for upcoming projects I'm working on. Unlock the code to the streets and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link below.